Hi, this is Kitty Wilkin from Night Quilter. Today I want to share a little more about my Pollinate quilt. My Pollinate quilt is an English paper piece pattern created with Karen the DIY Addict, and it's available on Karen the DIY Addict's website. You can look at Pollinate quilt hashtag to see all of the progress and fun things that people are working on so far on Instagram. A lot of people, when they received their kits, they said, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a bee, which is awesome. I love the bee. It's a really cute aspect of the pattern that, believe it or not, was discovered after the quilt was named. You probably won't believe me because it really seems like totally serendipitous. But this quilt, this pattern, the first time, like my first design, was the rainbow circle and then exploding into a low volume. That was the original design. And so I was trying to figure out a name, thinking like dispersal or, something that was naturey, but also, gave the idea of spreading good things around. And my brother, Steven, suggested the name Pollinate, and it kind of stuck. It's like, I think that's a really cool name. Only after this design was named Pollinate, and I was working on trying to fill in the space between the rosettes, did I discover that this little filler could totally look like a bee if, finagled the right way. And so that was just, the icing on the cake. So this bee it's intended to be the filler between the main rosettes. That said, I completely understand why you might want to jump right into the bee as soon as you get your kit. If you do, here are some tips to keep in mind. Now, piecing the bee, all of the instructions are included on page 8 in your pattern guide. So all of this that I'm going to talk about today is already included in your pattern guide, but I figured I'd walk through it for those of you who maybe prefer video to reading, and just to remind you of tips to keep in mind. As you'll note with your pattern pieces that come with your pattern, N, O, PQ, and R are some of the main pieces. Those are the pieces that make up the body of the bee. You'll note the asterisk on each of those pattern cards. That means that these 4 pieces do not come with acrylic templates. The reason for this is that the bee is filler, and it only appears 4.5 times in the quilt. So for pieces that you don't really need all that many papers, you don't have to cut all that many pieces for these, we figured for simplicity reasons we would send them out without acrylic templates. For that reason also, I would recommend tackling it by first laying it out on the table in front of you. Some of the pieces are a little bit tricky. To help both you and I in this video, I'm going to quickly label each piece, so then when I refer to it, you'll know exactly what piece I mean. So these are the end pieces. I'm going to wiggle it all around. That's okay. Those are N. Then we have O, and these are O pieces. Now O is an equilateral triangle. No, it's not. I take that back. It is not an equilateral triangle. An equilateral triangle has all 3 sides that are exactly the same. O is an isosceles triangle. So one of the first tips that I give you is that when you take out your O pieces, find the short edge. And so sometimes you can look at it and you could say, oh, I know the short edge. If you're not one of those people who can immediately identify which edge is the shortest, you can compare. And if you see those 2 pieces, if you put them point to point, the bottom point is lined up, you can see one is longer than the next. That means that this is the short edge on this piece. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put an arrow in the center pointing to the short edge. The short edge faces the outside of the bee. So now that I've found this short edge, I can use that to help me find, voila, the other short edge. So mark your short edges. That will help incredibly when it comes to the piecing stage, because then you will know that those arrows point to the piece that goes around the outside of the bee. I had this all perfect. Now it's going to be all wobbly, but that's okay. So that's tip number 1. O pieces, mark the short edges. Next we have P and Q. In the pattern guide, I write at one point, mind your P's and Q's, which I think is funny because I'm sure you've heard the saying, mind your P's and Q's. I think that's please and thank you or something like that. What is Q? I'm not really sure what that means, but mind your P's and Q's. These pieces are unique. They fit to fill the space, but when you look at them, sometimes it's hard to tell, like, all right, which way do they go? That's another reason why I suggest laying it all out on the table in front of you before you start. Because once you have it all laid out, you'll know which direction they head. The wings, just to jump to the wings for a second, because I'm going to move them out of the way. The wings are made up of 2 A pieces and then B C's. This is the same as 5-pointed stars. So the 5-pointed stars that go, both, not that one because that one has F around it, but the 5-pointed stars that loop around, that are part of the star chains. This is the same pieces. There are acrylics for these. You can piece these and cut these the same way you do the other pieces in your pattern. For now, so that I stop knocking them out of the way, I'm going to move them off to the side. Because what I'm going to do is show you how to cut your fabric even though you don't have acrylics. There are the wings, out of the way. Okay, so now we have our bee body. We have the O's and the N's, and now that I've got it all lined up, this is another way to make sure your O's, you have your short edge of your O shape. If you line it up like this, come on. All right, that's gonna be a little wonky. If you line it up like this and it fits perfectly, you know that you have your O short edge. So I'm gonna draw an arrow to the short edge. Now let's take for a second, say I didn't do the arrow and I try and fit it. It's not gonna fit perfectly. See, there's either space there or this is out. So it's very subtle. Sorry, that's the way it needed to be to fill in the space, but it's absolutely doable if you just take the time to identify the short edge first. All right, so all of your pieces are labeled. They're all laid out. You've got your short edges of O's. You know to really watch your P's and Q's. What I do to avoid confusion is I take the pieces from here, move them to my fabric and cut, and then put my piece back. That way, directionality, fussy cutting, all of that stuff, nothing gets confused because the pieces are going exactly the way they are. I know that this bee is in this direction. So as long as I put it on the fabric face up, like right side up, I'm cutting fabric that will baste on top of that pea and will be perfectly ready to go together. That said, with your O's, if you baste your fabric on this side, you'll need to put an arrow on the other side too so that you could see it once the fabric's basted on. So make note of that in terms of directionality. But with these, because they're isosceles triangles, they will go anywhere you need. They can go like that. They can flip over. You know, they will fit where they need to go as long as the short edge is out. All right, so cutting. Move these over. I am working on this bee right here. And in my plan, there's only one bee who's already mostly formed. This guy, he's almost fully together. And so I've already got the bee that looks like a bee. So now I'm working on the low volume filler bees, just to explain why I'm cutting from all white fabrics. But I'll bring my cutting mat over. There we go. Slide this over a bit so you can see it. Slide this over a bit. Now what you want here is a ruler with a 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch mark. They have special rulers at a 1/4 ruler works, and its benefit is it has a little bit of a lip there. So if you are cutting, let's start with O. Say I'm cutting O from this fabric because this is what I'm using. stitched by Allison Glass, using every last little scrap of this that I can. So I want to make sure I'm cutting the fabric with at least a quarter inch edge around each side. And so this lip will catch on the edge of the paper template, which will make sure you have an even quarter inch. I actually prefer to have a 3/8 edge. And so I might use just a regular, my Olfa rulers all have 3/8, these little lines. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 spaces within the inch. So if you go into the 1, 2, 3rd line, that would be 3/8. So I'll make sure I have 3/8 down there. Yes. Rotary cutter. Rotary cutter would help. You line up 3/8 and carefully cut there. Close your blade, always close your blade. Leslie made sure I remembered that. This one's for you, Leslie. And 3/8 again. There you go. Now a 3/8 inch on either side. You'll note that I didn't cut all the way to the tip, because really you don't need, if you could go all the way up and meet those lines, but as long as you're 3/8 of an inch away from your tip, that's plenty of fabric. And by cutting it this way with points on the bottom 2 edges and a blunt point on the top, that's another way for me to know which direction. You know, I know that the blunt edge goes on the opposite side that the arrow is pointing, if that makes sense. So then I have this fabric is cut. I've got it so that I know that I could baste that right on top, or because these are able to be flipped, I can go like that and baste it, and then I would put it back. Or I might take it, put it in a stack, and say, all right, that one's done. Next piece. And then I would take my next piece and cut it. The ones you really want to pay attention to are your P's and Q's, so let's pull one of those over. Find a P, find about 3/8. Once you do this a lot of times, and depending on the amount of accuracy you want to keep, you can just eye it and make sure you have enough fabric around the edges. And at this point, rather than using a ruler, now note that this is a high risk activity. So I can't recommend that you do this without a ruler, because with a rotary cutter, rotary cutter with no ruler adds a little bit of danger. But if you wish to live this way, this dangerous life, you can just cut around it, making sure you have enough space. And so I will, cut about there, cut about there. That's a little close, but that's all right with me. Put it there, and closed up. And there I have my P shape, my P fabric. Now, for this way, I'm cutting the fabric so that the fabric will be basted to the labeled side. If you don't necessarily have to label them here, and if you don't label them, then it's not as big a deal. But once you cut your fabric, I just stack it, because that's going to be my basting pile. And so next, since I want Q, make sure it's in the same position, because if I flip this, all of a sudden that's P, and that's not what I want. This is a mirror image. And so with Q's, I want to make sure it's headed this direction. I'll find this, a spot, and carefully cut right around it. If I'm being super careful, I will use a ruler, maybe a rotating cutting mat to be extra helpful, but there you go. So once you have all of your pieces cut, continue for the rest of the body of the B. You can use your acrylics for the A, the B, the C, the D. There are the pi hex Ds around the sides. And then on the tops and bottoms, there's the house, which is an M, and the 2 little E shapes. Those also have acrylics, so you can use acrylics to cut those. Once you have all of your pieces cut and basted and you're ready to dive into sewing it together, there's one more thing to note. And I'm going to take these off to put this back together. I know a lot of you have jumped into the bee already and they are looking fantastic. And so keeping these tips in mind, especially if you're relatively new to English paper piecing, will help set you up for success. Okay, so once you have all of your pieces, now imagine these are all basted together. Okay, we'll get out our imagination land. Hang out with my 6-year-old who's always in imagination land. First thing you're going to do is sew the O and O's together. So there are 2 of them. Now, one thing that we noted in the testing phase is that if you're not careful about keeping the O points together, it's sometimes hard to then sew this to your PQ pair. So what I would recommend is tacking. You have your 2 O pieces. Tack those points together. Just 1 stitch, tie it off, they're stuck together. Then sew your N, kind of inset your N into that point. That way you are ensuring that these points are together and will very neatly and nicely fit into your PQ pairs. Once you've sewn these together, then you're going to sew your PQs into pairs right along that short edge. I always like to start with the short edge. When I'm basting, I'll start with the short edge. Just get that folded over nice and neatly first before you mess around with anything else, because the long edges will baste really neatly. And once you have these pairs together, then again, you're kind of insetting everything together and it all comes together nicely. So first you're going to sew your PQ right along that short edge. You'll sew that one, and you'll sew that one, and then you'll sew it all together. So you kind of inset this in. Again, you can either go along the edges, just like with my last video about basting and stitching. You can go right up, down, along the edge in one direction. Or if you're having a little bit of trouble lining up the edges, or you want it to be absolutely perfect, or lining up the center, you can start at the center and stitch out, and start at the center and stitch out. Same with the R. You can either stitch along that line or start at the center and stitch out. Then you add on the PQ, you add on the NOO, ONO, and there you have the body of your bee. Next you would piece your wings, and I'm going to bring one of these over. That one's all wonky. Okay, so piecing your wings you can tackle however you want. The first time I pieced my very first wing, I figured, I'll piece these first and then stitch them together. That works, but for whatever reason, I really prefer to stitch the B and C together along this short edge first, and just everything comes together better for me that way, and then stitch this seam as the absolute last seam. So what I did is I basted my A's, stitched them together like so, basted my B and C, stitched them together like so right along there, and then inset this to my A pair. Now this is all stitched together. Once I had this, I would stitch these last pieces, which is a C over here and a B over here. I would stitch them starting here, or if you want, you could start at the point and stitch them along the A first, and then I'd kind of fold up this edge so that they're facing each other and whip stitch right up. And that worked the best for me. Once you have your wing sewn, you stitch that right in. Again, same as before, stitching in one direction or starting from the center and stitching out. Do it again for another wing, and there you've got your bee. If you want, part of the bee is the fun antenna. Just remember that when you're doing the outside edges, the little house M and the E triangles, make one side black, or whatever color your bee is, to match, to look like antenna. And so from far away, it looks a lot more like a bee with its antenna. And then the other side, this is kind of hanging on to the edge of my rosette. So this side of mine is part of the color flow. And then for the other bees, these whole hexagons will be part of my main big rosette, and the rest will be low volume. So hopefully that will help you tackle the bee successfully. And again, all of these instructions are right in the pattern guide, pages 8 and 9, talk about the bee. You have all of your tips. I have the tips about tacking the O's, stitching that point together first, and marking your papers on your O's with an arrow. So it's all in here to help you out if you need a reference. But hopefully this will be helpful, And I'm really looking forward to seeing all of your bees pop up on social media or email me at thenightquilter@gmail.com. I'd love to see what you're working on. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.